Good morning, fish keepers. Cam here from thefishroom.co.nz. We've done it. We've made it to Friday. Happy days. Apologies to John. He's not going to be with us. Unfortunately, he had a wee issue with his daughter, and they've ended up having to shoot up to the hospital. Everything will be okay. It means he's unable to be here tonight or today. So apologies to John. But that's not going to stop us from having a good time. So let's bring up our guest. Good morning, Serkan.
Good morning. How are you going?
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
I would also like to extend my thank you to say thank you for getting up at such a ridiculous hour. For those that are unaware, it's around about 5:30 in the morning for him. So I think that is quite a stellar effort. So thank
it's
you very
much. It's actually 5:02 at the moment, not 5:30. So
5:02.
Yep. So,
oh man, that's even worse.
This is how much I love fish.
Oh, thank you so much. That makes me feel real bad. That's ridiculously early. Thank you very much.
No worries at all.
Okay, can you tell us a bit about you, who you are, and how you got involved in aquariums and tropical fish?
So my name is Serkan, and I'm a aquarist or fish keeper from Canberra, Australia. I started keeping fish like most people quite an early age. On my 11th birthday, my uncle and aunt brought me a pair of guppies as a birthday present in a little bowl. And sort of that started my fish keeping. But I've always been interested in sort of nature and animals and things. So by the time I received that pair of guppies, I have already been keeping, turtles, salamanders, birds and stuff. So, but at 11 years old, I got my first pair of fish in a little fish bowl. So I actually sympathize with people who do start keeping their fish in a fish bowl, and in today's online environment, their heads get chopped off when they tell that in an online environment. But what happened with me, I got the pair of guppies on my birthday. A week later, I had two bowls. Two weeks later, I had a small tank. And a week after that, I had a 4-foot fish tank. So that's sort of how my fish keeping progressed.
Yeah, it's pretty rapid.
Yeah, it's sort of quite rapid. And so that's kind of sort of, my interest in things. Once I become interested in them, I go deep into it. And I was basically, at the time, I was born in Istanbul, Turkey. So I was in Istanbul, and there wasn't too much information about fish keeping. There was a few very sort of brief books available, but they were sort of also hard to find, etc. So what I ended up doing, sort of going to the aquarium stores as much as I can in that young age. The thing that probably really kept it going and also made me more and more interested, my uncle that gave me the pair of guppies, he actually had friends who were aquarium fish importers into the country. So over the next few years, a number of times my uncle took me with him when he was visiting those friends. So I ended up seeing those import facilities, and being the nephew of the friend, what they would do is they would assign a staff to walk around the sort of tanks with me, and they would give a big sort of wholesale bag that they had. They were actually quite interesting bags. They were sort of like this diameter, but they were sort of around almost a meter long. And they would walk around with me in those tanks, and I would actually pick whichever fish I wanted, and I would actually take them home for free. And even back then, I only wanted to keep fish that I thought I could breed. So even though they were 101 different types of fish to pick from, I always picked live bearers, because at the time, with the knowledge I had, I thought I could only breed live bearers. So that's sort of how my fish keeping started. And then we migrated to Australia when I was 16. And here I started sort of keeping some other types of fish. And then not many years later, I joined the local aquarium society here with the logo of. And that's basically when I got introduced to a whole heap of other fish like killifish, the Australian and New Guinea rainbows and Corydoras and things like that. And that's basically when my fish keeping interest broadened, and then basically sort of took off from there. So probably apart from that initial few years, the fewest tanks I ever had was 4. So currently my fish room has 132 fish tanks. So
that's a good number. That's a real good number.
Yeah, it sounds a lot, but because of the type of fish I keep and how I keep them, they're all small volume fish tanks. So most people who do have fish rooms have larger fish rooms with more volume but fewer tanks. So, and that was basically quite early on. It's actually partially my thinking of what I can keep and what I can breed. Quite early on, I decided to focus on fish that I can keep and breed in smaller tanks, so that I can have more different types and species of them, because I have a bit of a collector personality. So whatever I keep and breed, I like to keep and try to breed as many different species and types as possible. So small tanks allow me to do that, and most of my tanks, it's species only. There's only one type of fish in there, unless I'm raising fry, sometimes together and stuff. But and having that many tanks allows me to be quite flexible, and then when a new species turns up in the market, I don't even have to think about whether I have space or not, because I don't often have fish in every single one of the tanks, so that when I also breed, I have tanks already available to raise the fish, the fry, so I don't have to worry about space. So it gives me quite a bit of flexibility. And I just figured out a couple of months ago that I can actually squeeze in another 10. So currently I have another 10 tanks in, sort of they're making them for me because they're sort of quite odd shape, so I can squeeze them in between the other tanks.
I love it. I like that you mentioned a collector. I think that is something that's overlooked in our hobby quite often. Like, people are either like breeders or just lots of display tanks kind of thing. But being a collector and keeping species only tanks, I think, is something that's really overlooked. And there's a lot more people that enjoy that than I think we kind of realize, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like, for me, like everyone's hobby, for themselves, whatever gives you the most enjoyment, you should do it that way. For me, though, rather than having a 4-foot tank, I can divide that into 4, and I can actually keep 4 different species in that tank. And obviously not every type of fish is possible to be kept in those volumes. And so because of that, for example, long time ago, even though I like them, I decided I'm not going to keep African cichlids, for example, because the sort of volume of tanks that I use, it's just not going to work. And it's so I have lots of friends who breed African cichlids, so I just visit their fish rooms when I want to get my African cichlid sort of fill in etc. So yeah, and we all have different tastes as well. So for me, before the nano tank and nano fish thing was a thing, I've been keeping nano fish and nano tanks basically. So it just gives me a lot of flexibility, being able to sort of keep the fry separate and the fish separate. And from breeding wise, when you keep a fish in their own tank, you'll increase your success rate times 4, basically.
Yeah. So what specifically drew you to Killies and Corydoras? Is there a sort of a story behind that, or is it just evolved to be?
So with the Killies, like I mentioned early on, sort of in my teenage years, I basically only kept live bearers because I thought that was the fish that I could breed. So I bred basically every sort of variety of live bearer guppies, platies, swordtails, mollies that I can get my hands on. I would get different varieties and breed them, but essentially the breeding mode is the same.
Mm-hmm.
I only started breeding egg spawning and egg laying fish after moving to Australia, and the very first fish I bred was the white-clawed mountain minnows.
I like them.
They're awesome fish. I have 2 species of it now. They basically, if anyone hasn't bred any fish before, often live bearers get recommended. White-clawed mountain minnows is another one, probably as easy to breed as live bearers. But I started getting into trying to breed some other types of fish. And in my local aquarium society at the time, there were a number of people quite heavily interested and involved with killifish and killifish breeding. So often every meeting, there would be 1 or 2 species will come to the meeting in the meeting auction, and sometimes people would just bring a rare pair of killies to give a talk about them and etc. So I ended up getting my first pair of killies at the local aquarium society, and I managed to spawn them within a couple of weeks. And I thought, oh, this is quite interesting. So having that collector personality, I went and got another species and another species, and basically haven't looked back in terms of killies. And for the Corydoras, it was partially what was available at the time, and partially me going probably subconsciously which one of these other types of fish are infinitely collectible. And Corydoras having so many different species and the size they were at the time, readily sort of 10 odd species available. And if you kept looking around careful enough, you found another sort of 10-15 species. So there was fair bit available. In Australia, the whole Corydoras genus is on the allowable import list, so any Cory can be imported. So there were a number of them available, and Corydoras was basically in competition with L numbers. So I was like looking at L numbers as well, sort of early on, and I don't have a large enough income stream to be able to go Pokemon the L numbers. So it's made me drift towards Corys, and with everything, as you start keeping them, you find out more about them and you breed them. It sort of, fills you with sense of accomplishment. And because for me, breeding fish is not about just breeding fish. When I breed a fish, I feel like I have given that fish the best possible care that I can, and and the fish thought it was good enough that it sort of goes ahead and breeds it. So sometimes, I look at fish breeding in my fish room, I look at that as me actually giving at least okay care, that they are sort of going, okay, the conditions are favorable for me to reproduce and produce the next generation. So that, and the more species I bred, the more down the rabbit hole I went with the Killies and Corys. And my nick KillieOrCory came from back when the aquarium forums online were quite a big thing. When I was joining the very first one, it basically asks you to pick a nickname. And I was like, okay, what am I going to call myself? And I went, well, I'm really interested in Killies and Cory. So KillieOrCory came about, and I basically used that ever since. So,
cool.
Yeah.
We've had a question from one of the watchers. Have you had any experience with Fundulopanchaxostidae? I'm butchering all of those words.
Yeah, so that the common name for Fundulopanchax, well, Sugestidae, it's a, as far as I know, it's a Dutch person's last name. So since I don't know Dutch, and I don't know if you know Dutch, however you pronounce it is correct. It's a blue gularis is the common name for that killifish, and it grows to a decent size,
Cool.
sort of 10, 12 centimeters, sort of quite a big fish. Yes, I kept and bred them in the past. They are what we call a switch spawner. So you can spawn it on spawning mob, but you can also use peat moss to spawn them. And because the fish are quite large, the eggs are decent size as well. You incubate them sort of either in water or in moist peat, and depending on the temperature, they sort of hatch in 2 to 3 weeks. So a beautiful fish. It's basically almost like king of killifish, really. It's very big, robust, red and very flaggy tail. It's an amazing fish. I don't know if you guys ever, I'm sure you had them in the past in New Zealand, but I don't know. So at the moment, we don't have them in Australia, unfortunately. So hopefully a new import of them will happen in the sort of near future, because it's an amazing fish to keep in breed. And because of the size, you do want to keep them in slightly larger tanks than you would think for your average killifish, because average killifish is your perfect small tank fish, really. Yeah. So the blue gularis, I mean, at this size they're adults, but they do grow this size. And there's a variety called dwarf, and that doesn't grow as big, and it's a bit more red in the front half of the fish. So it's a beautiful fish.
Cool. What's your imports like for, as far as like legislation and stuff like that, for getting killies in? Is there a heap you're allowed, heap you're not, or are they kind of open?
So we are sort of a bit similar to New Zealand in that we have an import list. Whatever is on that list is allowed to be imported in. That doesn't always mean, whatever is on the import list is readily available in the trade to import. But the good thing that happened early on when they were putting the import list together, I'm not sure who was involved in sort of getting that list happen. They put 3 killifish genera, the Ephiosemian, Epiplates, and Eplocalius, which is the Asian genus, on the import list. So any of the species from those 3 genera can be imported in, as long as the importers can find them on the list of their suppliers. They can come in. So previously we were able to get fairly interesting killifish occasionally turn up from Germany, and that was before COVID. And since COVID, flights from Europe is a lot more expensive. And there's also, they changed some requirements in the Australian import regulations, so it made importing fish from Germany a little bit trickier. So we don't get European fish into the country anymore, or as regularly as we used to. So most of our fish come from sort of closer Asian countries. So that dried up our supply of interesting when I say interesting, less commonly seen killifish, basically. So every killifish is a rare killifish, actually, in the grand scheme of fish keeping hobby. Even the most common killifish is not that common. And so for the Australian hobby, especially, it is really important, whatever species are here, we should continue to keep and breed them so that we don't lose them in the country. So, because in Australia, I've been keeping killies close to 30 years, and the number of species I've had and since have been lost to Australian hobby is probably close to 50 different species, really. So if I had, like, in hindsight, if I had managed to keep every single one of those going, we would have quite a lot of different species available in Australia. And life changes, your priorities change, and then we often lose killifish in Australia in the past because we thought everyone else had them. So people stopped breeding them because lots of other people are. And then 2 years later, we realized everyone was thinking the same, and we're down to the last male or the last female, and that killifish sort of disappears. And before Australia had that import, if you like, restriction come on with the list and stuff, in the 60s and 70s, people used to get eggs in the mail, and that's how some killifish came into the country before that list was put into place and with the restrictions. So,
yeah, very similar things happen here. A friend of mine breeds African cichlids, and it's a similar type scenario. Everyone's breeding them, so they stop breeding them, and all of a sudden nobody's got them anymore, or they die out and there's no more coming in, and one person will be left holding a bag, and then you hope that someone's got a male and someone's got a female, and they're happy enough to join them together and not have too much of an ego to say, no, I want to be the one, if that makes sense. So otherwise, once they're gone, they're gone. And so many cases of fish, obviously in New Zealand, but clearly over there as well.
Yeah, and the sort of the fortunate or unfortunate thing with killifish is people are like me, either sort of absolutely mad about them and super interested in them, or it's not even in people's radar. So because of that, there isn't a huge demand for them. And then it also means that, I would pay any amount of money to get a new species, but in the market in general, they're not as valuable because the suppliers and, shops and etc., they're not too sure if they get them, whether they'll be able to sell them and things like that. When people become aware that they're available, they actually sell very, very well, because most killifish are super colorful. They some of the most attractive looking freshwater fish. It's just that people often go, I didn't even know killifish was available to buy and things like that. So it's because of that, it's only have been people like myself who have interest in the fish to keep and breeds them. And in my long list of why I want to keep killies, it's basically not even on the list, because I'll breed them and so I'll be able to sell them, sort of a thing. I do end up breeding quite a lot, and I have friends who own aquarium stores and etc., and they're always interested in having some in their stores. But that's sort of, it's sort of, it needs a bit of a push and a, I don't know, have to come up with an ad campaign to make killifish a bit more popular in the hobby, so that the species are actually kept and bred a bit more often, so that they're widely available. Because often what happens, someone gets interested in killies, and like everything, they're like really interested in a short window for a fortnight or 3 weeks or a month, if they can find the fish, they might be hooked for life. But often, with something as rare as killifish, sometimes they don't get to find it in that window, and then they move on to something else, which is fair enough for people to do. So, and I was lucky enough, Killifish actually found me at the local aquarium society meeting, really. So, yeah.
So, because we're on the topic of Achilles, we'll use them as our base question.
Yeah, of course.
How do you get more people interested in them? They're beautiful fish, and if you know what they are, you know that they are very spectacular for the best part. Why do they not have a following? Why is there not more people interested in them? How can that be changed and adapted?
So actually, currently the market is such that I don't see why there shouldn't be a big surge of interest toward killifish, because what has been happening with the hobby in the last so many years, with, I suppose, the way the energy prices go and etc., more and more people are interested in keeping smaller tanks and nano tanks and nano setups, and people keeping smaller tanks rather than giant tanks is a more of a common thing. And killifish are actually one of the true nanofish, because often people think about nanofish as small fish, so I can keep it in small tanks. But even a fish like neon tetra, the volume of water it's actually found in, it's not a nanofish. It happens to be small. And a lot of the other little fish that people keep in small tanks, like small school in a small tank, they're often found in very large bodies of water. Often killifish are found in smaller bodies of water, and even when they exist in a large body of water, they're in niches where they're sort of on the margins, where there's sort of only a few inches or centimeters of water. So they actually are really adapted to living in sort of quite restricted and small environments. So in effect, there should be more interest in killies, and I think it is mostly to do with supply. If they were available, more readily available, more people will get interested in them. And there is a role to play for aquarium societies, and also specialized aquarium societies as well, like killifish associations. There are a number of them around the world. Unfortunately, with the internet and sort of the Facebooks and etc. of the world, the interest and participation in aquarium societies dropped, because people were able to find their information and if you like, interactions, they started to find them more readily online. So attendance to aquarium societies reduced, which is a bit of an unfortunate thing in my opinion, because everyone has a voice on internet, which is excellent, but not all voices are equal, in that you don't know if the person who has an opinion on keeping killies have ever kept them or have been keeping them for 30 years in the way people write things. And I'm using killifish as an example. So what I do in my local community, every couple of months, I hold a small killifish meeting, and people come look at my fish room and my different fish, and other killie keepers from the area, and also from as far away as Sydney, which is about 3 hours drive. They drive to my place, and we have a little killifish meeting, and about half the people that attend don't even keep killies. They're interested in them, but they're like, one day I'll be able to set up a tank to do so. Being able to do that, I'm sort of locally getting the sort of trying to keep the interest growing. And one of the reasons why the name KillieOrCory ended up being a bit sort of prominent online is I'm actually, wherever there is fish talk happening, I go there and I talk about killies and corys, and that's sort of my 2 cents, because some people are very, it's their hobby, they don't want to share, what they're keeping and what's happening in their tanks and stuff. I'm kind of like the opposite, I just want people to know I'm breeding X species, and this one is going well, or I'm down to the last whatever of this one. So because of that, sort of, especially in Australia, when someone anywhere really ends up going, I'm interested in killies, someone ends up pointing them my way, and I sort of either connect them to other killifish keepers in their area, or I sort of help them find some killies, whether it's through local breeders for them or the shops that I know carry killifish in their area. So it's for me, they should be more popular. So hopefully, if we continue to have if you have a follow-up live stream 10 years from now, we'll be talking about everyone keeping killies, so.
I think what you're doing is probably a really good way of achieving that. Talking about them, being around people and conversing about them. Because everyone talks about African cichlids, for example. Seems to be what I pick on the most, but everyone seems to talk about African cichlids. They're bright, they're flashy, they're showy, they're in your face. And people that keep them tend to be a lot like that as well. But if you're out and about talking with people, it begins to spark an interest, and it's probably the starting point of getting people interested and involved.
Yeah.
We had a couple of people comments from the question they put forward. Brendan thinks the short lifespan of most killifish is what turns him off and why he hasn't kept them. Personally, that is the reason why I'm not overly interested in them, because I don't breed, and then knowing they're going to die in a short period of time is a thing.
I have a couple of things to say about that.
I was hoping you would.
Yeah. So that for me is a common misconception about killies, that they have quite short lifespans. Of course, they live however long they live for a relatively small fish, but your average killifish will live longer than your average guppy. So we do not think of guppies as a short-lived fish. So there are obviously, I haven't got into it yet, there are two broad categories of killifish. One group is called annual, and they come from bodies of water that dry part of the year. And the species exist just as eggs in the substrate. And when the rains come in the following season, and the puddles fill with water again, and the eggs hatch, and they grow at quite a fast rate. And then, the cycle starts, and they spawn, and eggs go into the substrate. And then the other broad category is called non-annual, and those fish are found in permanent bodies of water, so their eggs don't go through that drying period. And those non-annual killies, live 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So that's basically as long and longer than fair few of the different killies or different species of fish available to keep in our tanks. And even the annuals, even though they might live for 6 months in the wild, in our tanks, if you don't keep them too warm, like I had a annual killifish Notobranchius rudewultecampi, which is a African annual killifish. My one male of mine died at 18 months of age, so that's actually quite a year and a half for that fish in the wild that lives for about 6 months. So they do, and they do grow from egg to sort of mature adult size or age, however you want to call it, fairly quickly. So depending on how you keep them, you have quite a decent period to be able to spawn them and keep them going as well. And with the non-annuals, some of the ones I keep, I think in the fish room now, I have 2 fish that are like super long in the tooth, around 7 years old. So they do live a lot longer than people think. So, and when people have the, I suppose, second-hand information, and what that is it's you read articles and etc., and you see someone do a YouTube video, and they might have just got a pair of fish just to do a YouTube video and things like that. So, which is like fair enough. I really like it when people do that, because that also puts killifish out there. So by all means, more people should do that, but they haven't really kept the fish going for generations and maybe long enough to even figure out how long actually this fish lives. So for me, it's if people have kept small tetras and guppies and things, these fish live as long as them, if not longer. So,
and that's a really valid point. A couple of things that have just come up to me before we bring up the other questions is, you said that you had one that lasted about 18 months, when in the wild they last 6 months.
Yep.
Have you ever looked at trying to extend the life of your ones in the aquarium? So you've got a male female that lasted a year, so you're going to try and spawn from them. Their spawn then lasts maybe a little bit longer. You push them to 14 months and to see if you can extend them, or is that playing God and not really possible?
So basically, that's actually exactly what I do in my fish room. In my fish room, I heat the room rather than individual tanks. So what happens is, because I'm heating the room, on my racks, my higher tanks are the warmest and my lowest tanks are the coolest. And I keep my annual killies, the ones that go through that eggs drying period, in my lowest tanks. So they're basically around sort of 20, 21 degrees Celsius, and I did a conversion. It's around 70 Fahrenheit. So keeping them there, I actually keep them well in excess of a year, and after that they still continue to live, but they basically don't produce as many eggs, etc. So the downside of keeping them at that lower temperature is I do not get as big spawns as when people keep them sort of at sort of 25, 26, 27 Celsius, which is like 80 Fahrenheit, around there. So you do get a lot more eggs, but the fish actually all their systems are working a lot faster, so they actually age faster as well. So keeping annual killies cooler actually extend their life quite a lot, So, and often, I had in the past, we get pairs of fish from same source with friends. They take them to their fish room and they start breeding them, and I take them to my fish room, I start breeding them. They are on to their second generation and etc., and I still have the original fish still in my fish room. So that's kind of what happens. That's how I do it, basically. So you can actually extend their life fair bit if you can actually keep them on the cooler side.
You're right. Cool.
Yeah. So
Maxie's just throwing a wee comment in that she's off to run to her fish room to cool everything down a little bit.
Yeah, very nice to have you here, Maxie. Yeah.
So back to the comment about why more people don't keep them. Jeff has thought that maybe the name puts them off, thinking they'll kill everything, being killifish, which I guess is quite a logical mindset. Having that in the name could be saying that puts people off.
So the name killifish actually comes from the word kill, and it is a Dutch word. And sort of Dutch, having gone to Africa relatively early on, described these fish that were found in kills, and kill in Dutch apparently is a small body of water or a puddle. So they were describing these fish that they were finding in puddles and small ponds and stuff. So they call them fish from kill. And then killifish is basically, so I probably butchered that explanation a little bit. If anyone speaks Dutch, my apologies. But that's sort of where the origin of the name comes from. Killifish is, the fish from small bodies of water, which is Dutch word for. So it has nothing to do with actually killing and things like that. And so that's also like, and the comment is quite fair when you don't know that. So I even say to people I keep killifish, they hear it as you keep killer fish, so that's sort of, and so that's also a common thing that happens, but it is basically kill meaning small body of water, really. So
there you go, folks. Tune into the Fish Room streams to get some history lessons on how fish are named. I never knew that. I had no idea. That's awesome.
Yeah. So
very cool. Maxie has also asked a question. In the Australian killifish trade, do you sell eggs, or is it common now to sell live fish over eggs like we do in New Zealand?
Yes. So amongst each other, it's a lot easier to swap eggs. So we basically just send eggs to each other. But when we are sort of like when my friends who own aquarium stores, they like to have the fish because, people can see, and then it actually allows the hobbyist that purchase the fish be able to give breeding a go straight away. So it sort of has that advantage. But I actually have one of the aquarium store owner friends in Melbourne. He's actually quite keen if I can figure out a way for him to have killifish eggs available in his shop. So I'm sort of like trying to figure out if I can make that happen for him, sort of a thing. So it's a lot easier to do with annuals because when annuals spawn, you store the eggs in moist peat moss for around 3 months for the species that develop the quickest. So you have quite a long window, like if fish spawn and then within that month, that bag of eggs are available in the store with the estimated hatch date of X, people can buy those eggs and then sort of try to hatch them themselves and raise them. There's actually online through eBay and stuff, there are some Thai fish breeders, I suppose, advertise killifish eggs to buy, but it is pretty much illegal in Australia for us to import eggs into Australia. So if anybody from Australia buy eggs and try to get them shipped to Australia, more often than not, they get a little letter saying, please don't do that. And then they actually monitor your mail for the X period after that. So I really would not recommend anyone from Australia to try to get eggs from overseas. It's easy and straightforward to do within Australia, but from overseas, it's a bit of a no-go.
I'll
because
just
of
add a wee disclaimer that it's pretty much the same here in New Zealand, so it's not really worth trying. The more people that try, the more the regulations are going to get worse. The more regulation gets worse, the less fish that'll be available in the hobby as a general rule. So also not available or advised here.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then my only advice to people, if you have your heart set on a particular species of fish, if you can be a little bit patient, people like myself in your area will work hard to make sure that you get those fish. Unfortunately, it's sort of, we can't usually make it happen that week, that fortnight, but we will eventually get the fish to you. So it's really not worth trying to get the fish from overseas sources, because it's, you basically shoot yourself in the foot and everybody else with it as well. So
obviously they've evolved to keep the eggs in soil or peat, as obviously breeders use. How has that evolution come around? Because that's a really cool trait that they have that other fish don't really have.
Yeah, so with killies, some of them come from, if you like, rainforest streams and sort of habitats that are similar to that. And those sort of habitats, the water flow changes with the seasons and etc. But the water never dries out, So the killifish from those areas, their eggs are quite robust as well, but they don't go through a drying period. The fish that are found in more open areas, in sort of ponds and puddles, those environments, part of the year, the whole, if you like, the whole body of water, not just part of it, just completely dries out. And what these fish have done is they've developed this, if you like, trait or this way of coping with that harsh environment, with eggs being able to go into almost a type of hibernation. So when the eggs are actually in the water, they develop at a certain speed, but when they are actually in the substrate and the substrate is actually dried or drying, the duration that the eggs take is actually extended for quite long periods of time. And some annual killifish, actually, even when you breed them in your tanks, you keep the eggs in the moist peat moss for pretty much up to 9 months sometimes. And those are the fish that are sort of sometimes a bit tricky. If you don't do what I do, the adults might die, and then you go, maybe I have that fish, maybe I don't, because you have bags of eggs, and you might hatch and get hundreds, or you might hatch and not get many. And one of the other really cool things that these annual killifish do is they have a number of distinct, it's called a diapause, these resting stages of the eggs, so that when the rains come, if it's actually I'll just put a name on it, this is not accurate, if it's a false spring, as in it rains for a couple of days and the water puddles fill a little bit, but that wasn't the main rain, and then the puddle dries out in the next few weeks, you basically don't lose all the eggs in one go. So what happens is, when the rains come, some of the eggs hatch, and some of the eggs actually go onto that second stage of resting period. And then, if the puddle dries and the next rains come, that's when they hatch, and they go through that 3 times. So when we actually breed annual killifish in our tanks, we store the eggs in the peat, and for the required time for that species, and we usually look for eyed up eggs, and that's when we wet them. So what we do is we put the peat moss in the water to get the fry to hatch, and you wait for about 48 hours to 76 hours, and then you re-dry the peat for another 2 weeks, and then you wet the peat moss again, and you get some more fry, and you can do that often 3 or 4 times, and you keep getting more fry from the same collection. So they're truly amazing animals that they sort of develop this way of dealing with those harsh conditions. And if you think about it, the fish that might have existed in those areas that did not develop this strategy basically would have gone extinct. Really, they would have ceased to exist in those areas. And if there were any killifish that only had 1 stages of diapause, if it will only take 1 year, there's that false rain where after a couple of weeks the ponds and puddles dry again, that species would be lost. So the ones that are around sort of have that consistently, sort of that 3 stages of type of hibernation, really, for the eggs. So they're truly amazing.
Wow, that is very, very amazing. Max, you'd like to know, what other mediums are you using for peat spawners now that peat is considered not sustainable?
Yes, so peat moss have been one of the most common things used in breeding annual killies. Sort of cocoa peat, the peat that is made from coconut husks is also used by some people. Often really fine, I can't remember the name, rounded sand is also used by people. And actually, when killifish annual killies are used in laboratories in scientific research institutions, that's what they like to use because it's a lot easier to sterilize and etc. So they spawn their annual killies on. They actually use superfine glass beads to breed the annual killies. So sort of anything peat-ish does work, cocoa coir, sand, if you can find the right one. You can even spawn annual killies on mops, really. So the main difference between annual killies and non-annual killies is annual killies don't have a egg that is sticky, so they don't stick to the substrate as much. So if you spawn your annual killies in mops, as soon as you move the mop, all the eggs would actually fall off. I don't know if people are actually mostly listening or watching as well. I use this sort of container to breed my killies in. It's just a little soup container or a takeaway container with a lid cut with a hole at the top. And I put peat moss up to this high. Fish go in from the top, spawn in there and come out. But you can also jam a whole heap of spawning mops in your container like this, and annual killies will actually go in there and spawn as well. I don't know if anyone has experienced, numerous occasions I caught a pair of annuals, I put them in a fish bag to take to a friend or to give a friend, or I received annual killies in a pair in a bag, and the fish actually have spawned in the bag and there's no substrate there. So the fish actually will spawn anywhere, even on gravel. It's just that, whether we will be able to get the eggs out or not. So you can even though I haven't ever done it, you can even have, if you have your annual killies on a bare tank and have a gravel bottom in your container, and every few days, if you took the container out and gravel whacked the gravel in the container, I'm sure you can get eggs that way as well. So there are many ways that can be done. It's often what is convenient for you to be able to store the eggs, etc., afterwards as well. So that's why peat moss has been the most common things to use. But cocoa pear and sphagnum moss also have been used by people. But you can spawn them on anything and then incubate them in sphagnum moss or cocoa moss or cocoa peat as well. So
you've already mentioned some pretty cool, interesting traits that killies have, but what's the one thing that appeals to you about them?
I really do like the behavior of the fish. They're basically micro predators, really, because their natural, if you like, food source is small invertebrates, like both aquatic and terrestrial, like insect larvae or ants falling on the water and things like that. So, and crustaceans like Daphnia and those sort of things. So they are sort of these micro predators that are highly colorful, and they don't move very fast when they are hunting. So what they do is, so they sort of move very slowly towards the food item, and then they go snap. So it's sort of quite fun to watch. Even if you're feeding pellets, you drop the pellet, they see the pellet, they sort of approach it slowly, and then boom, they go. That's kind of why sometimes killies don't make great fish for community tanks if you put them in last. So if you would like to keep killies in your community tanks, you can, because most people would worry about putting killies in their tanks. Are they going to nip my fish's fin and things like that? But the main issue would be, will they be able to compete for food? Because your average tetra and rasbora and etc. would actually just go to the surface as soon as the water the food hits the surface. And because killies have that sort of feeding behavior, they actually might take a while before they go for the food. So in a community tank, they might initially suffer and not get as much food. Having said that, I do train my killies, to be a lot more actively seeking the food. So, and the way I manage to do that is I raise large groups together. So when there's quite a number of them in a tank, they actually then truly start feeding, like your tetras, etc. So like I have a tank with, I don't know, 30, 40 FFCD striatum, which is a small killifish. Its common name is five-line killifish. It's sort of red and blue and green. So it's an amazing looking fish. So I have 30 or 40 of them in the tank, and the moment the dry pellets hit the water surface, they just all go. But where I have a single pair in a tank, I drop the food and they actually take, not too long, but they actually take 5+ seconds before they sort of swim up to the pellet and get the food. So they are highly trainable, but you do not want to put them in as your last fish. If you can put them in as your first fish and then slowly add the other fish, that would make a much better community tank sort of a thing with killies.
I think at least you're sparking a little bit of interest in me when it comes to killies at the moment, and you probably are with a few other people that are watching at the moment. What are some of the basic care requirements needed to keep them flourishing?
So killifish, because of obviously not all killifish are the same, but because of the environments they come from, they are quite tough and robust fish. So even the ones that are found in areas where the water doesn't dry out. They're basically out in the sort of these marginal areas where the water is a lot more shallow, etc. So the temperature difference might be a lot more than the deeper water, etc. So they are, I actually call them bulletproof myself, because they're actually some of the most tough and robust fish in my fish room. Once you know the care requirements, is in the temperature range they like, etc., they're very easy to keep. The sort of the water can be slightly soft, slightly sort of hard. You know, the only issue you will have in the extremes of water parameters is how fertile the actual eggs are. The adult fish will be actually fine often. You know, if your conditions are stable, you know, your tanks are not sort of constantly fluctuating, they're actually some of the easiest fish to keep, in my opinion. But you know, I'm like a walking advertisement for Killifish, so don't take everything I say with a pinch of salt, right? So they're really tough. I find them hard to kill. Not that I ever try to, and very rarely a killifish in my fish room would die due to a disease or some sort of tank issue. I lose fish because sometimes they jump. So haven't talked about that yet, but killifish do jump. So you occasionally lose killies because you have tight fitting lids. You take the lid off to feed your fish, and then you get distracted and don't put the lid on as well as you can. And there's a tiny little bit corner open. And what killies do is they look at that and they position themselves and then manage to squeeze through that tiny gap. And they have ability to do that because even the ones that come from some of the permanent bodies of water, because they live in that marginal areas, what happens is when the water system, water level goes down and up, the puddles they're in, sort of the marginal areas sometimes have more water and sometimes it has less water. There's water nearby, but the puddle, the space that they're in, the water might start to dry up. So what they do is they actually jump out and then sort of flip-flop on the sort of surface of the you know, creek bed or wherever they are to the next puddle and then the next puddle, etc. So they, and also they jump out to catch ants and flies and things like that as well. So they're sort of use that being able to jump out ability fair bit. And in our tanks, what happens is my recommendation to people, if you buy a pair of killies, the first couple of months is the most important. It's when the fish are getting used to your tank and your tank condition. That's actually when they will jump out the most. And after that, actually, they still potentially will jump out. But, you know, if you occasionally leave the lid off, it's not going to be as big a deal. They'll still find a way, but it's in that first crucial couple of months. You really want to make sure that the lids are on. And on the rare occasion I lose a fish to jumping, it's because I actually moved them from one tank to another. And that's that cycle of, you know, they seeing if they can go back to the original puddle or pond or whatever sort of happens.
Wow.
So yeah, so they sort of, I went on a bit of a sidetrack, but you know, yeah, so they, you know, there are so many amazing things about killies. If you like, I just give you another little story. I have this South American non-annual killifish. It's sort of one that grows about this big. It's it used to be called Riverless Europotamus. the genus name changed. It's called Anaplepsoides europophthalmus, but they come from South America and they grow this big, and they actually have a quite a interesting way of, if you like, moving about. They sort of move a lot more slower often than the West African killies, non-annuals. And one of the things these guys do, which I find they're quite reptilian, they would be like this, in the tank, and they almost like turn the head and look at me. So that I find that really cool. And the other thing that these fish do, which is a little bit annoying because they sort of scared me a number of times, they actually jump out of the water. And they jump out of the water, and because the lid is on, the sort of the air is quite humid between the sort of surface of the water and the lid. And often, even when I have the lid on, I sort of end up having a fair bit of gap here, so that when I take the lid off, they're less likely to jump. And if they jump sort of, they have to jump fair bit. Anyway, in that zone, the glass ends up being, sort of moist and etc. because of the humidity. These fish actually jump out and stick themselves onto the glass, like the, almost like, the mud skippers, your previous week's guests, they sort of outside and they sort of stuck on the glass, and I walk into the fish room and I go, oh my God, this fish jumped out and stuck on the glass and it sort of died. And I go try to poke it, and as soon as I get close to it, it just jumps back in the water. So they're sort of amazing, sort of these fish. So yeah, so there's a lot that makes me love them, really.
Wow, cool. You've mentioned a couple of times that they're micro predators. So as far as feeding goes, do you feed them a lot of live foods? If so, what live foods are you feeding? And other than that, do they easily take pre-prepared commercial foods?
Yes. So also in the past, one of the common opinions, or one of the common things that were said to people, if you want to keep killies, you have to make sure that you're feeding them live foods. So they actually require a high protein diet, and live foods is sort of one of the easiest ways to achieve that. And they do like hunting for live food. So culturing live food is actually very important, and I do culture a number of different live food options. But I actually, every single killifish that I have in my fish room, feed dry food as well. So even from a sort of fry, like when they're 2-3 weeks old, instead of feeding them baby brine shrimp regularly, I start feeding them decapsulated brine shrimp eggs. So they basically just hang on the surface for a while before they start to sink. And as soon as they start eating that, then I move them on to, as they grow into sort of slightly larger, soft granules and stuff. So basically, I would say 95% of the time, all my killies eat dry food. But I do culture paramecium, vinegar eels, microworms, white worms, grindle worms. I buy black worms by the buckets load. But, in terms of volume, 95% of the time, all my fish get dry food. And during the periods where I'm actively trying to breed killifish or some of my cories, that's when I feed 95% of the time live food to them, just to get them into the breeding condition and breed them. But some of the killies I have, I think some species I'm up to like third generation, and they're get occasional live food treats, and the adults actually never get live food. They get permisium and things like that when they are young fry.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have a personal favorite species of killies right now? I know that's obviously quite hard to pick sometimes, I understand.
So I basically have two versions of that, and two types of answer to that question. One is my favorite killies are the ones that I'm currently keeping and breeding, because they're the ones that I'm sort of like, finding super interesting. Oh, there's another egg and everything. And the second answer to that question is every killifish I don't have yet. So, so any killifish that I haven't had a chance to keep and breed yet, I'm interested in. And there are some species that are available in sort of European hobby and in the North American hobby, and also in sort of parts of Asia in the hobby there. Some of those species have never been to Australia, and some of those I sort of look at them and I go, that it would be great to have them in. And interestingly, some of those fish, the genus that they're in is actually on the allowable import list, so technically they can get imported. It's just that those species are not readily available with the suppliers for the importers to have access to them. So occasionally I hatch plans to try to do a private import, but I need to play lotto a little bit more often so that I increase my chances of making that happen one day. So,
What have you found to be the most challenging aspect of keeping killies?
The most challenging is sometimes, like I've been keeping killies around 30 odd years. One of the most challenging aspects is actually to keep for me, this is my personal thing, to keep the enthusiasm going year after year, because what happens is, over this 25, 30 years, there were periods, there were lots of people like me around me where we are constantly talking about killies, we're swapping species and etc. And, we're sometimes swapping even the same species, just sort of keep the, if you like, that genetic diversity in our own population sort of a thing. But then sometimes what happens, what I sort of tongue-in-cheek call, births, deaths, and marriages happen in people's lives. People go to school, graduate from school, they move town, they get married, they get divorced, they have kids, etc. Parents get unwell or they get unwell. So people have lives, our lives sort of ebbs and flows. So in that 25, 30-year period, I had periods where there were lots of people like me around, and then I had sort of felt like I was one of the very few left around, and then it sometimes gets harder to keep the enthusiasm going on your own. So for example, me talking about killifish with you and everyone online today, I'm sort of like supercharged now, and because it's it's 6:15 a.m. So when the live stream is finished, I'm going to go into the fish room and check the mobs of every single killifish I have there, because I'm sort of now filled with sort of this renewed enthusiasm and, if you like, this charge. And sometimes that has been a bit tricky to keep going. And the other tricky thing has been, like I touched on before, sometimes there are too many people breeding the same species, so you go, I should focus on other species and not this one, and then you don't realize that no one's breeding that, and then we're down to the last male or last female in the country, and that ends up being quite disappointing. So with a friend of mine who lives relatively close to me, I mean 1 hour drive away. So now we are on a mission to make sure that for the short term, at least for the next year or two or more, we plan to not let that happen to any of the killifish species we have in Australia. So between him and I, we've been trying to get our hands on as many different killies available as possible. I mean, already had most of them anyway, but there's like the odd one that, other people have. We've been trying to get them, and what we're doing between him and me, we're trying to breed them without paying attention to how many people are keeping and breeding them, so that we actually have large groups of them, so that we are less likely to lose them in the near future, at least. Because even some of the most commonly regarded as common fish, Gardneri, I'm sure people would have heard, it also goes with the common name steel blue killifish. I think Gardneri is a relatively common, or regarded as common killifish. Like I said early on, even the most common killifish is rare. In Australia in the past, we had 5 or 6 different localities of Gardneri, and because over the years everyone assumed everyone else was breeding them, we lost all those different localities. So the Gardneri we have left in Australia now is without a locality code. It's just what we call aquarium strain Gardneri, which is still as beautiful a fish as your fish would come from a specific locality, but we had these distinct 5 or 6 different types of Gardneri which we have lost. So we now want to make sure that we are not going to let that happen in the short while, at least that's our goal. Hopefully we'll able to achieve it for most of the species that we are keeping, because some killies are a lot more straightforward to breed. Some requires a little bit more attention, but often the ones that are a lot easier to spawn are as easily lost as some of the trickier to spawn killies as well, only because everyone assumes everyone else is doing it.
Yeah. How many different species do you have between the two of you, and how many do you think might be currently eluding you both?
We probably have around 25 different species and types, and some of them are like same species, like different locality, or same species, a albino version, same species, a different color mutation of it. So because we don't have access to as many different species as they do in the European and the North American hobby, basically any killifish is worth keeping. So I have some albino Gardneri in my fish room. Also have a gold mutation of Gardneri in my fish room. If I had access to different species with different localities, probably those would be the ones that I would choose not to keep, just because of space situation. I rather keep a distinct species with a locality code, but we don't have access to too many, so we're trying to maintain. So we have about 25 or so different species, and those some of the color mutations. So there is, for example, there's a common niche killifish called Australia. It comes in a normal coloration. It's sometimes called a chocolate, and there's a gold mutation of it, gold Australia, and there's also a mutation of it which is doesn't have any spots in the body, and that one is actually sold as in the Australian hobby as a fire gold. It's like a fancy trade name, but when that mutation came about, it was called a spotless Australia, and it first appeared in South Africa about 20 years ago, and when it appeared, it was quite an exciting thing, but yeah, so we have that about 4 versions of Australia in the Australian hobby, and I think between me and my friend, we have 3 of them. So yeah,
Wow.
so yeah.
Cool.
So there's a few other ones that in the next year will make attempts to acquire, and the thing is, we are not really trying to Pokemon them. We are not trying to collect them all for the sake of collecting them all. We're trying to collect them all so that we really so we become another person that's actually actively trying to breed and sort of distribute that fish and species so that we don't lose them in the Australian hobby. So that's our goal, even if we end up being, 80% successful, 70% successful, that still will be something, because I feel like as the years are passing, as I'm sort of getting a bit more mature in my years in my fish keeping, I feel like I need to take a bit more of a responsibility to make sure that some of these species are continue to be available in the Australian hobby, because I have had friends and people I consider as my mentors that have done that for years. And I always, if I lost species X, I knew if I contacted my friend, I would get that species back again. And I feel like I now need to also get into that sort of place so that I become one of those people that I always done that, but I didn't do it as deliberately as I'm trying to do it now. So so it sort of changed the way I'm breeding them as well, because I used to breed enough for my next generation and just a few pairs that I can distribute and give to friends. And now what I'm doing is I'm just basically trying to breed larger numbers so that I have them available, and we are less likely to lose them if they are sort of there in numbers, sort of a thing. So that's the current plan anyway. So
do you send your killies around Australia? Like, is there sort of the population bases of stronger killie keepers around the country, or kind of potted in a couple of spots?
So I live in Canberra, and here basically there's like 4 of us who are active, I would call active killifish breeders. And if we count my friend who lives an hour from me, there's like 5 of us in Canberra. And there's probably another 15 people who have some killifish species in their tanks, and they breed them occasionally and stuff, but they are not as actively doing that. And there is a group of killifish keepers in Sydney and Melbourne as well, and sort of up north in Brisbane. But Australia being as sort of widespread as it is, there's a number of us, and sometimes there is 1 or 2 people is nuts about killies as me in those areas. And so we do send fish and eggs to each other, and killies actually travel quite well in your normal fish bags or breeder bags and stuff, and we swap fish quite I would say regularly, semi-regularly with each other. Like 6 months ago, a friend of mine in Melbourne, which is like 8 hours drive from me because he's just outside of Melbourne, I sent him 4 species in a styrene box. I couriered it off to him. So we do, and he sent me eggs of 2 species that I didn't have. So we do swap fish with each other a fair bit, but also we do have some restrictions. For example, I can't send fish to Western Australia because their quarantine processes are a little bit different than
Really?
rest of Australia. So they sort of not, yeah, they do have their own, like you have to get a specific permit and etc. The box needs to get inspected and that sort of stuff. Whereas some of the other states of Australia, I can just send them quite easily. Same thing with Tasmania. Whatever fish arrives there needs to be inspected, and also Tasmania have their own allowable list. And actually, this reminds me, I'm helping a killifish keeper in Tasmania add a few more species of killies onto the allowed into Tasmania list so that they can be potentially imported into Tasmania. It's imported, it sounds a bit weird because it's still the same country, but they have them being an island, they have their own.
That makes sense. Yeah. But it seems a bit weird that Western Australia have their own kind of can and can't do's, being at the same landmass. I guess because it's significantly further away from the likes of Sydney and Canberra and stuff like that. They're kind of semi-isolated at the same time, but on the same landmass.
Yeah, so it's same landmass, and we're also, like, all the populated areas are sort of quite, distance. There's a fair bit of distance around, but also there are a whole heap of unique ecological niches. So it's sort of fair enough to sort of not want, things that are in the eastern states. I mean, there are certain, for example, plant diseases that exist or quite prominent in the eastern states that they're trying to not be, come to the, Western Australia. So things like that, so they are a lot more, and all these rules are there for a reason, so yeah. So yeah.
Cool. So the other part of your YouTube handle and your name is KillieOrCory. Do you want to swap sector a little bit and go start talking about cories, or you want to keep rocking with killifish?
I'm happy with either. They're sort of two of my favorite topics. But I always say to people, I haven't met a fish that I didn't like. I like all fish, and in my fish room, apart from killies and cories, I have tetras, rasboras, danios, liberas. I have a few sort of cichlids as well. I mean, I have some angels and some pelvica chromis, like crebences, like dwarf cichlids. So I like all fish. If it swims in the water, I actually like them. So it's just that because of my collector's personality, I actually don't. I like to focus on one thing and do focus on it well, and all my other ones, I call them my side quests. So I sort of breed a few tetras and a few danios and things like that. And I actually have a friend who's for years been trying to get me to start keeping and breeding apistos, dwarf cichlids, because he knows that if I got into them, I will try to Pokemon them and try to get as many different species as I can. And I've been resisting quite well so far. And Corydoras is another one of those. I really like their behavior, the variety that there is. And I bred close to 45, 50 different species of cories to date. And each one is similar, but there is actually a fair bit of differences when you look at it in the way they behave and they spawn, and how they deposit their eggs and things like that. So it's a another fascinating group of fish. To be fair, again, whichever fish group you look into, they're all fascinating, but these are the ones that I'm sort of really sort of went down the rabbit hole in a little bit, actually. Yeah.
I love that you refer it to Pokemoning it, because I totally understand, and I'm sure many people absolutely understand what you're referring to there. But also, you're right. If you want to niche down into any kind of subspecies of fish, you'll find interesting elements to all of them, whether it be live bearers, tetras, Raspora, Achilles, Corydoras. It doesn't matter what it is. When you really begin to work into that particular group of fish, they're all fascinating in one way or another.
Yeah, they truly are. And with the Corydoras now, we always knew that there were distinct groups within Corydoras, and you had a guest on a few weeks ago that talked about the different groups of Corys, and the new classification and the new genus names and things like that. And so people who kept many different types of Corys like myself and bred them, it's very easy to see, these two species are more alike than some of the others. So it's actually easy to go, actually, these two can be potentially are in a slightly different group than these ones, in the way they swim around, in the way they behave, in the way they do their territorial, if you like, conflicts and stuff, and also in just general morphological characters, their head shape and the body size and things like that. So yeah, it's a amazing group of fish, and they're infinitely collectible for someone like me. And having the whole genus on the allowable import list, basically we get a good number of species imported. And again, just like all fish, the importers are interested in what they can sell. So I'm sure, if they have access to 60 different species to import, they choose to import, 10, and 6 or 7 of those might be ones that they import regularly because they know they sell. But occasionally, well, more regularly than occasionally, we do get new species popping up. So I'm constantly looking at wholesalers lists to see, if there is one that I can't resist and I should also get. So currently in my fish room, I have about 40 species of Corys, and
Cool.
so it's a lot of fun, and they are very, I mean, my wife finds them cute, the way they swim and feed and stuff, and it's really cool when they move their eye in their sort of head. So that's sort of, it looks like they're blinking, and when you provide them a nice fine sand substrate, you can see them sort of burrowing in, almost up to their eye and sometimes beyond, looking for worms and things. So they are actually quite personable and stuff as well. And I do like observing my fish, and that's actually how I have been successful in breeding most of my fish, or that's why I think I've been successful, because I do sit and watch my fish quite a bit. So when the fish actually change their behavior and start to display what we would call courtship behavior and stuff, I notice it, and then in the next few days or the week or whatever, I look in that tank a bit more carefully for eggs and things like that, and that's how I'm able to find the eggs and breed them. Because as you would appreciate, having a 132 fish tank fish room, I don't get to spend too much time looking at each tank every day. So when I'm feeding and etc., as I'm glancing through the tanks or doing general maintenance, I'm sort of watching my fish as well. And then when I see behavior change in the next, period, I specifically focus on those tanks a lot more. And that's basically where most of my fish breeding actually success has happened, because I'm sure I have had many other spawnings happen in my fish room, and if I have not noticed that behavior, I wouldn't notice the eggs, and the eggs would hatch, and the adults would, eat the fry and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand it. Like, I've walked and I've checked out a couple of tanks, gone, I've got a fry there that like a juvie that I'd never seen before. I've clearly missed the entire process of it, and then like you spend a little bit more time. You go, okay, hold on, wait a minute. We're in the water over the next couple of days. Something's gonna kick off here. So
so when I have things like that happen, where I find fry of something in a tank, even though it's fish breeding, I don't consider that as I bred the fish. So what I do is, after that, I focus on that tank more, so I actually catch the next spawn, and I'm able to look after the eggs and the fry much better. So you end up raising more of the fry. And actually, because I have so many different cories, often what I'm doing is number of the species I have, I'm actually growing them, because I don't try to spawn my cories until they're about a year old.
Yeah.
So I'm basically just feeding them, doing maintenance, water changes, etc. But what I do is I have these little grids that I got one of my friends 3D print for me, that have like really short stubby legs, and I put those in my cory tanks with a Anubias or Java fern, or a little crypts in a little pot on top of that. So there's like a half a centimeter or so gap under there, so any spawning that happens without me noticing, fry actually have quite a decent space to hide under, because once the fry are a few weeks old, the adults actually leave them alone. So that's how I sort of like, for example, one of my cories, I'm not actively trying to spawn them. I bred them many times before. One called Gold Laser, CW10. I have a tank of them, and I have that grid in there, and I just noticed the other day I have quite a few fry growing with the parents, and normally that's not a big deal, but this is a relatively small tank. It is a sort of 25-liter tank, which is 7 gallons or so. So it's a lot of fish in a small area. So any spawning that would happen there, I would expect the adults to eat them, because the fry would just swim under their mouth, and then they'll just eat them. But having this grid there, there's about, actually, I thought there were 3 or 4. The other day, they were all at the front. There's actually 6 good sized fry there. Actually, I need to take them out now. So actually, cories are not that, some species at least, not that difficult to breed either. Often the reason why not a lot of different species are bred is access. Not a lot of people keep different species of cories. They tend to find in their market what is most commonly available, or they don't seek out the more unusual ones, because they tend to be not necessarily any better looking, but times 2, 3, 4 the price range. And if you're putting some cories in your community tank, a stir-by or a panda would fit the bill, rather than something that is more rare. So, and some of them are super challenging to breed as well. I have had some species where I kept them for 3, 4, 5 years and I haven't still, cracked them as well. So one of my breeding strategies, though, I actively try to spawn 10, 15 species of cories, and when 5 or 6 of them spawn, I feel like I'm a good cory breeder, So it sort of works well for me.
You've said before that you're keeping quite small tanks in your fish room. How big are the tanks that you're spawning your cories? And how big are they?
Yeah, so I have 3 main size tanks in my fish room. They're all relatively small. I have 25-liter tanks, 35-liter tanks, and 55-liter tanks. And so these are 7-gallon, 9-gallon, and 15-gallon. I did the conversion for our friends in other places that speak in gallons. So they're all relatively small. I call them my smallest tanks, the 23 to 25-liter tanks. In Australia, we call them Kmart tanks because it's a size of tank that's sold in a for North American purposes, Walmart-like store where you can buy anything from kitchen stuff to clothes to toys to everything. So they have a pet section and they sell a small aquarium with a little filter and rainbow colored gravel and a fake plant in it and stuff. So many people actually found the tanks relatively good size for what and the price that they are. So we used those tanks. I bought some of those kits, kept the tank and chucked everything else away. And so I bred probably 15 plus species of my cories in that little 25-liter tank, and bunch of, or pretty much all the rest in my 50-centimeter tanks, which is 35 liters, and 2 species I bred in my 2-foot tanks, which is sort of 55 liters plus. So it's about 15-gallon. So they're relatively small tanks in the grand scheme of things. So, and the other thing that I should mention, how often it's recommended to buy minimum of 5 or 6 of a species when you're buying cories because they like to school and stuff. That works quite well when you want to keep them. But when I'm breeding them, I often spawn them in pairs and trios and occasionally in groups. So, and with the lineage 1 species, a pair is basically all you need because if you have 2 males, they fight. So they're the long nose, saddle nose, the ones that grow a little bit bigger. So it's actually a pair in a 35-liter tank is the sort of size you should have.
Durable.
But when you're interested or when you find a species of cory, there's quite a few online resources that basically gives you those recommendations. But everything I've done basically is trial and error for me, and also what works in my conditions. And I go, can I replicate the same things that I'm doing for species A? Can I do that for species B as well? So that's my starting point. And then if that doesn't work, I'll start changing things one by one to see which one of those changes actually do work and the fish spawn. So,
Cool. What species are you currently working on at the moment?
So I got currently spawning CW133, which is a small, sort of like a dark orange or light brownish colored fish, which sort of spots all over the body. And it's regarded as a small not a micro species, but it's relatively small. And I was actually a couple of weekends ago, I was at the ANGFA convention, which is Australian New Guinea Fishers Association convention up north, and Hans-Georg Evers was there, one of the Cory experts. He was visiting from Germany to give a talk on New Guinea rainbows, and I took the opportunity to chat with him there, and I actually showed him photos of my CW133. So he was actually looking at them and going, oh, it could actually be something new that he hasn't seen before. So that's kind of exciting that, it's, I either have 133 or something relatively unique. So they're spawning. That's quite exciting. I have a group of CW51, which is in the trade, it's sold as the new panda. It's sort of like a light colored whitish fish with almost like a horse saddle like black mark on the back. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to spawn them hopefully soon. They're sort of been spawned in the hobby, but they're not spawned very regularly, so it's not a very straightforward fish to
very
spawn.
cool looking fish.
Yeah, and I got a few long nose or saddle snout fish. I have Corydoras fulleri, the fish that was named after Ian Fuller. So I'm actually keen to spawn that one. And but lineage one Corys, I feel like personally they need to be a lot older for them to spawn. So I'm actually growing my group. So that will probably be another 6 months to a year before they are ready to spawn. And I have C121, and I'm pretty sure if people are not into Corys as much as I am, and most people wouldn't be, some of these names don't mean anything, but you can sort of side Google them.
Exactly what I'm doing.
Yeah, Corydoras C121 is again another light colored fish which has a sort of a dark stripe on the back, which sort of looks like Corydoras adolphi or duplicarius, if people are familiar with those. But they also have this sort of plate just at sort of adjacent to the gill, or it could be on the gill, but it's sort of this little sort of brown plate on the side, and it's quite a unique species. It's thought to be related to Corydoras burgesi. So I'm again growing a group that sort of half showing me we're going to spawn soon and half not. So I'm sort of working with those, and I have a couple of Espidoras species that are spawning. The lasers are spawning on their own. I have Corydoras davidsansi, which spawn for me every week, which I'm trying to increase their numbers because it seems like currently I'm the only one in Australia who have them. So I'm sort of trying to sort of get a large enough group to send to one of my friends in Sydney who have a store there, so that they can get distributed. And yeah, so there's always, I have Corydoras oya pocuense, which is sometimes called flag-tail panda. So it has a mask and the tail is barred. That one is my wife's favorite Corydoras, so I really should be spawning that very soon. The other day they were doing courtship behavior, and I really thought they were going to spawn, but they didn't, but 3 other species did, so it was still a good spawning period, but not that one. So yeah.
What got you originally interested in the Corys? Was there a pull there for you, like the Killies?
Yes, so to be honest, again, I'm just going to say the variety that was available and them being schooling and what I knew or didn't know very well back then, all Corys will school together, kind of an idea. So I had this one tank, which was a good sized tank. Before I bred any Corys, in that tank, I had over 20 species of Corys. So I was basically buying one of this one and two of the other one. And, because, even though I knew I should be getting 5 or 6 of each species, someone had told me, or I read somewhere different Corys would school, I would just do that, and and it would look this mass of different markings and spots and masks and stuff. So they looked really cool. And now I know, having kept and bred them for so long, they all have their own individual behaviors. Some would school with others, but most would prefer their own species. So
yeah.
So I now keep my Corys in their own tanks, and then I have a few larger tanks, which I call them my Corydoras fruit salad tank, where I have lots of different species. Some species I'm growing so that they get old enough that I can put them in their own tank to try to spawn them, and some I'm actually growing the next generation for myself to replace that species adults that I have, so that I keep having that same species in my fish room for years to come. So I sort of do that as well. And yeah.
How are you finding keeping them kind of all together? No drama there, no issues, anything like that?
No, it actually reduces the it's actually probably not just with Corys. I mean, Corys are on the spectrum of fish that can have personality issues. They're actually quite mild. When you do keep any fish in sort of larger groups, the territorial and behavioral issue, the stuff gets, if you like, spread to a number of individuals. So rather than one fish picking on another one, because that fish swims and then in their field of vision and eyesight, a whole heap of other fish appear, and so their aggression is, let's call it, diluted. So that's what happens with fish when you have a number of that. That's kind of why, for example, a fish like some of the barbs that can be quite finippy and stuff, they said you should keep 8 of them or whatever together so that they pick on each other rather than other fish in the tank. Same sort of thing even with the long nose, the saddle nose Corys. When you have lots of different ones, by the time this one goes to that one, get out of my space, 2 other fish land in that field of vision, and I find they're relatively straightforward to keep in large groups. Obviously, anyone who's trying that and doing that, keep in mind how many fish you can keep in a tank and things like that. And for fish like Corys, which are bottom dwellers, most species, bottom dwellers, some like to use the mid-water column fairly regularly, but most of them, settle on the bottom. The floor space is more important than the depth of the tank. So the more floor real estate you can provide. So some of my larger tanks, they're actually more shallow, so that I can actually stack more of them on top of each other and sort of provide more floor space for them. They're very.
Yeah, I'm about to embark on putting all of my Corys into one tank together. I'm a little bit dubious about that at the moment, but we'll see how we go. So I've got around about 20 species. It's going to be a 5-foot tank, so I'm hoping there should be enough play in there for a short 6 month or so time. So
you shouldn't have any issues. If any one of those species is panda Corys, they will try to spawn with anyone and everyone in that tank. So if any fry appear or eggs you see, I would get rid of the eggs, and the fry, if they grow, I wouldn't worry about them because they are likely to be hybrids, because I found Corydoras panda males are some of the most, I don't know what word to use. They're
Randy?
most yeah, most interested in breeding fish I ever seen. They try, as long as it's Cory shaped, they'll try to spawn. And even if the fish is not Cory shaped, they sometimes do go, would you spawn with me, kind of a thing. So yeah, so good thing for them. The thing that's going for them is most people find them cute and stuff. So they're sort of quite prominent in hobby. But if actually anyone is interested in trying to give breeding Corys a go, often the bronzes and albinos and peppards, your Aenis and Pleiatus types are recommended to people. I would actually say, just put Corydoras panda in your tank, and after 1 year, if they haven't spawned, I would be surprised.
Yeah. Mine spawn regularly, but they don't seem to produce, if that makes sense. Like I've found numerous eggs, but I sort of leave them be, and nothing really comes from it. So but I wasn't aware that they will crossbreed with anything. I had zero intention of spawning from them. I was planning on putting maybe some dwarf cichlids or something like that to pick off anything while they were small, fingers crossed. So yeah.
The most common group of Corys that are available, which panda is part of, is the genus Hoplysoma now, and Corydoras panda would spawn with, or try to spawn with, any other Hoplysoma, and with good number of them actually will produce fry hybrids, like with Julii and Trilineatus, and with Stobies and things. So if hybrid fry appear in people's tanks, Cory breeders like myself, we don't like hybrids because there are so many different species available. We really don't need hybrids in the hobby. If you're interested in, having a different spotty or masked fish, it probably exists. Any type of masks and spots and lines you can think of, nature and South American river systems have already produced, so no need to try to hybridize them. If it happens accidentally, it does happen, just let them be. And if you end up moving the hybrids to someone, just tell them to not to breed them, or give them to someone who just wants some Corys in their community tank. And but yeah, pandas are the most promiscuous, or whatever, fish there is in the Cory world.
Totally didn't know that, but I think I'll probably keep them separated for just in case reasons. So yeah.
And with Corys, anyone trying to breed them successfully, most people would get eggs in their tanks. The successful way to do it is actually to take the eggs out and hatch them separately, and to try to raise fry that way. And that's when people would have most success. Even if it's like having a little breeder net in the tank and putting some of the eggs in there to hatch and for the fry to grow the first few weeks, and then you can release them back into the adult's tank. So because once the Cory fry are a few weeks old, the adults leave them alone. But if you have other fish in your tank, you want the Cory fry to be a little bit bigger before you release them in your tank, so that the other fish don't go for them as well. So
what's been the most challenging thing you've had when it's come to spawning Corydoras?
Some of the Corys, some groups of Corys are a lot harder to spawn than others. So I personally find the groups of Corys which are now in the Broccus species are, for me, the trickiest to spawn. Sometimes the challenge for me has been not having access to enough individual fish. So like when I found them, I only found 3, and because of their body shape and stuff, they're not as easy to tell apart whether you have males and females. So I would like keep them for a year and a half, 2 years, and when they're sort of old enough and robust enough, then I go, oh, I have only females, or I only have males and stuff. So I keep them for a fair bit, and no matter how good a fish keeper or fish breeder someone is, it's very hard to breed fish when they're all same sex. But the brokers group has been a bit tricky for me. I spawned a bunch of them, but they require a bit more care. So when I'm spawning more challenging cories, first off, I actually don't take anybody's account as this is for killies, cories, tetras I breed, anything I breed in the fish room. I gather as much information I can, but I don't take other people's assumptions on board in terms of whether a fish is easy to spawn or hard to spawn or impossible to spawn. What I do is, okay, in my conditions, whether this fish is straightforward to spawn, a bit trickier to spawn, or on some occasions, some fish have proven so far not able to be spawned. So what I do is I keep them in my general Corydoras keeping conditions and the general care and feeding. And then I go, okay, I had these fish for 2 years now. They're well and truly adults. Why haven't they spawned yet? Because some of the other species I got in the similar time frame have already. So I start to adjust water flow, increase the water flow, reduce the water flow. I add more, if you like, tannins into the water, or I make the tannins go away. I reduce the water level. I increase water change frequency. I decrease water change frequency. So I start playing with things. I add a lot of dry leaves into the tank and things like that. So I play with those parameters and try to trigger a spawn event, because in the wild most fish have distinctive seasons that they spawn in as well. Whether it's the rainy season and spring, summer, autumn, whatever. So what's happening is in my fish room, it's an artificial environment. Even if the fish are wild caught, or they might ancestrally remember it's in this period that we spawn, it is to environmental conditions. There's more food available, there's more water available, or there's increased flow because the rains come in. What does increased flow might mean? Well, there's more food going to float by. So I sort of try to fiddle with those things, and I try to do them one at a time so that I know which one of those actually have worked for that species. And even when I do something like that and it works, I don't assume that was what made the fish spawn. It just might have been, if I just persisted for another 6 months, the fish might have been truly mature enough and then they spawn. So what I do is I actually then try to spawn the fish in that identical condition a number of times, and then I take that condition away to see, now that the fish are regularly spawning, whether they will continue to spawn. And so far I found, like all percentages, I'm just making this one up, 7 times out of 10, when I take that particular condition away, once the fish actually has spawned a number of times, they continue to do so in my fish way. So and that's sort of, I suppose, one of the many reasons why the Corydoras group for me is so interesting. They're very similar in some ways, and some of them I end up needing to do these sort of things. And it just really keeps my interest going. And I really like listening to other breeders and keepers, and what they do and how they do it. And I still going back into my fish room, I don't do it identically the way they did it, but I go, okay, that thing they did, how would I do it myself? Like, for example, I had a species of Scleromystex, which is a barbatus group of cories. I had 3 individuals of Macropterus, and I tried to spawn them. I tried tons of things. Nothing worked, and the fish got old, and I lost them. And then online, and also in your podcast as well, I think when Rob McClure was here, he talked about how he managed to spawn them when someone from the actual collection location told him, you're keeping them wrong. They come in from black water conditions, So like, if I knew that back when I had the fish, I would have actually heavily, made that tank go black water. And the black water thing that I use is I use elder cones, which is a little cone from a elder tree, and they release quite a lot of tannins. So I use them, oak leaves, and sparingly I use almond leaves as well. But that's sort of how I get my tannins and stuff. When I kept the Macropterus, I treated them like barbatus because they're closely related to them. And my barbatus would spawn every 2 weeks, and the tank next to them, Macropterus will just swim around and not show any sign of breeding behavior, courtship behavior at all. And I kept them for years before without any success. But now, if I find that species again, I sort of know what to do, and the way I add tannins to the tank, I will give them a better go. So yeah.
Are you a note keeper?
Am I sorry?
Do you keep notes on everything, or is it all up in the
head? It's all up in my head. So I do keep notes occasionally, and then I look at my notes, and what I find half the time, the words I write, I am even confused what I meant there. So so what happens with me is I'm a visual thinker. So when I think, I actually see pictures. So what happens is, when I'm observing a fish, when I watch their courtship behavior, their spawning behavior, where I find the eggs and stuff, sort of weird sort of head and memory, those sort of pictures pop in my head. And I remember, Corydoras natereri or Hoplosoma natereri, when I spawned them multiple times, the eggs were mostly in the mop, in the corner behind the filter, like, for example, so that sort of stuff, I remember it, so that, if I get that species again, that's basically where I would put the mop straight away, sort of a thing. So yeah, I should be taking more notes. Actually, talking about that, what has recently happened, my local aquarium society, Canberra and District Aquarium Society, so a little bit of a plug for them. If you're
away.
Yeah, if you're from Canberra, you should join. So they recently restarted their Breeders Award program. So it's in the Aquarium Society. In the past, we had a Breeders Award program where people basically record and lodge their breeding and keep records, and then the Aquarium Society gives you like little certificate, beginner breeder, novice breeder, and whatever. I think in its previous incarnation, I was like up to advanced breeder or something. But they basically, and then they stopped doing that for a while. They restarted it, and part of the ways that you can get points is actually if you do record all the details of how
Yeah, right.
many fish used and water conditions and tank, and then they even would like, if possible, photos of eggs, photos a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. So for me to be able to get points in that breeders award program, so I would now need to keep more detailed records. And the other little thing that they're doing, which is I think a great initiative, they also want part of that breeders award program, the breeders to actually bring their fish to be auctioned, the progeny to be auctioned in the monthly meetings. So the breeders and the fish being bred as part of that program is actually going to appear more readily there's an auction at each meeting. But what happens with my breeding, usually I breed relatively rare and fish that I'm absolutely obsessed about, but other people, oh, this is too expensive at Cory's, whatever. So I tend to, very few of my fish actually go to the local aquarium society. I should actually be a lot more proactive. But with this, for example, now they have given me more incentive to have more of the Cory's that I breed turn up in the local aquarium society auctions as well. So yeah, I think it's a great thing, and I will be doing the same with my different killies as well. So to get more people interested in general keeping and breeding fish, really, because I feel like I live, what's the word, vicariously through other people. I have friends, like I said, who breed other types of fish, African cichlids and stuff. So as long as people I know keeping and breeding them, it's sort of like as a community we all are. So I don't have to have them as long as some other people are doing them. So yeah, so that's, I think, is a really good thing happening in my local aquarium society at the moment, which is actually going to make me keep a lot more detailed written reports than I have been in the past. So assuming I do it. So so we'll see. Yeah.
Let's have a quick conversation about your YouTube channel. How did that come about? What was your motivation for kicking that off?
So basically, my YouTube channel actually has started about 12 years ago, and I set it up initially only just to put some videos of my fish breeding, some of the fish that I wanted to show. My friend in another city in Australia, they couldn't come and visit me. I would do a little video of the tank with often not even talking, and then I put that up and then send them the link for them to look at. So over time, when I observed interesting breeding behavior, etc., I would record the video and then I would put that up online. Not fairly regularly, I get asked about how I breed a fish, and for example, how I do my live food cultures and stuff. So I've done videos on specific breeding a type of killifish or type of how I culture a microworm, for example. So I started putting those up, and it has been always my intention for it to be more information sharing rather than what mostly things are. It's sort of like, people, and this is like just what it is. It's not I have no I'm sort of fairly neutral about this. These days, what YouTube and etc. is about is, people decide to be a sort of an influencer of types, and they go, and I'm interested in fish, so I will be have a YouTube channel which fish is my topic, which is actually excellent because it's spreading the hobby and it's giving more access to people. People are able to share their interest and passion with each other. Mine is sort of mostly about, I'm sort of mad about fish. I like keeping them and I like breeding them, and 100% of the fish that go into my fish room goes in with my intention of breeding them. I'm not successful 100% of the time, but that's my goal. And I'm one of those fish keepers. If you like, I got apprenticed alongside some of the older generation fish keepers. I was like early 20s, and my friends were in their 60s, 70s, 80s, who were fish keepers in that cohort. And in that cohort, everyone was sort of super helpful in helping you be a successful fish keeper and fish breeder and etc. So anything they knew, they shared with me. So I have sort of that sort of an attitude. So when I keep and breed something or whatever, I would like everyone else to, if they like to know, so that they can do the same thing that I do, if they would like. So in my YouTube videos, and only in the last probably half a dozen plus, I started putting my face in. So because a few of my friends said my YouTube videos was missing personality, which is sort of me, because I have really bad dad jokes. I've been curbing them today, so not telling you dad jokes.
What did you do that for? You should have busted them out.
I sort of like to ease people into those. So anyway, so I started putting a bit of myself more into the videos, and sort of my goal is to document and show how I keep and how I breed the fish, and also show people how I managed to jam pack 130 plus fish tanks into my room. Some people are interested in that sort of stuff, so people tune in to look at it. And another motivation, like I touched on already, I do get asked a lot of questions about specific stuff. And throughout the year, I go through super busy periods and then periods where I have a lot of time. So I actually write really long essays replying to people, every little thing that I do, breeding species A, B, or whatever. And I do that over and over again. And it occurred to me, if I was to do a YouTube video of that thing, when I get asked that question, I can just basically send them the link and then go, if you have any further questions, please feel free to ask. Because a lot of the time, fish keeping or anything that we do, I sometimes go, it is a bit like cooking. When you like cooking and you do cook regularly, you become good at cooking because you have done that action many, many times. You figure out, you read the recipe, you go, okay, I make the recipe, and then you go, well, it needs a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that and whatever, and then you change that recipe. And fish keeping is the same. When you watch a YouTube video, when you read a breeding report or whatever, in your conditions and in your tanks, it's not really going to work exactly, because the person who writes the recipe or does the video, some things that you do naturally without thinking about might be an important detail or a step in that process that you actually leave it out, not on purpose, but because it's something you do, you don't even think about it. So I do, try to fill in, or my goal, I want to do more and more videos like that. I haven't done enough of them, but I want to sort of do every little detail so that I leave as few a gap as possible. But at the end of the day, whoever watches Breeding Corydoras X video or Breeding Corydoras in general video, the water that comes out of my tap is going to be different than the water that comes out of their tap. But there will be things that we can do to make our water softer or harder, play with temperature, the water flow and stuff. So so that's kind of what my YouTube video is about. And sort of, because I've been around for a long time, sort of I have some really ancient videos, but only in the last year or so, my sort of subscribers just went this way because I started posting more often. Actually, that's kind of probably the reason why. But yeah, I like sharing that information, and I always go, if something happened to me tomorrow, I would like people to be able to continue to be able to keep and breed some of the fish, because I have left some of that information in an accessible place. So I like sort of, that's another motivation for me to actually do more of them. So because when I say I bred 45 plus different species of cories, for me that's something I've done. It's no big deal really. If you kept this many tanks in this many different species, I feel everyone would. But I do also recognize there's fair bit of observation and experience that I accumulated that can help other people. And I'm sort of super enthusiastic, so people can watch those videos if they're sort of feeling down on their hobby. Just I'm happy to fill you up with enthusiasm as well. So
Cool.
fish keeping is a great hobby, and I call it my TV. So instead of watching TV, go into a fish room, or even if you have a single tank, watch your fish. They're amazing creatures. So.
We've had a question actually come up earlier, which I missed. Bob would like to know, have you had any luck with Corydoras? And if so, can you expand on that?
Yes. So aquarists, I had a chance to keep them only once so far. So I haven't actually spawned them to date. I have spawned Corydoras raubauti and Corydoras zygatus, which are in that same group, sort of semi-related-ish. Actually, when you spawn Corydoras raubauti, their fry juvenile development part of the way looks like Corydoras aquis, the fry growth stage coloring and markings and stuff. So unfortunately with the aquis, I had a very small group, and as it happens, the fish that you want to focus on the most, that's the tank that something that shouldn't happen happens. So I had them, I was just approaching, okay, I had them long enough that I should be trying to spawn them, and then something happened in the tank and I lost them, unfortunately. So I haven't had a chance to breed them. They are thought to be one of the trickier fish to breed, or less commonly spawned. I think they are eventually going to be a lot more readily spawned once people truly figure out what the actual trigger is. And I think F1, F2, F3 will be a lot easier to spawn as well, because they're in the same group with your Aeneas types, and also with the various lasers. And various lasers are relatively straightforward to spawn, and I can't imagine them being in that group and being uniquely very tricky to spawn for long periods. I think currently the difficulty is people are not having access to enough fish, not knowing the actual trigger, or not having access to F1, F2, F3. So because once I think we get there, they're going to be a lot more readily available and spawned, I think. So that was a whole heap of verbiage answer to that question without actually answering the question. So I'm very good at that as well.
Cool. Well, that brings us to the end of our set questions. So we like to end our streams with what we call a quick school of six. which is 6 really short answer questions that aren't meant to put you on the spot, but occasionally they do.
Okay.
So my first question for you is, in a coin toss, do you call heads or tails?
I call heads.
Cool. Are you a tea or a coffee drinker?
I'm a coffee drinker, and waking up at 5 a.m. this morning, this coffee number 2 and 3 are in here actually. But I do drink fair amount of tea as well. So, but if I had to pick, I would pick coffee.
Cool. Are we alone in the universe?
Oh, interesting question. Okay, so there's said to be billions, if not trillions, of galaxies, and each galaxy is having the number of different, let's say, things being that numerous, it is highly probable that we are not, but it is also very probable that we would never meet other, let's call them aliens, because of the sheer size and distances are involved. So we probably are not alone, but we probably will never find out.
Cool. If you could have a meal with someone, alive or dead, fictional or real, from any point in time, who would that be?
I probably would say David Attenborough, because when I was a young kid, I was interested in nature and all living things, and watching David Attenborough documentaries and other documentaries, I actually, well, initially I wanted to be a veterinarian, and then I sort of got a little bit older and figured out if I became a veterinarian, I would be mostly dealing with cats and dogs and livestock and stuff, not exotic animals and stuff like that. So, and then I switched to, I would like to be a zoologist, and, being a documentary maker like David Attenborough sounded like an amazing thing. So his documentaries really, if you like, fed my interest in addiction. So he would be, I ended up, studying zoology at university. So it's sort of, so David Attenborough would be my pick.
Cool. Paper, scissors, rocks. What's your first call?
Scissors.
Cool. What is your unicorn fish that's one for you to keep, spawn, take photos of, own? What is that one that has just avoided you, or you'd like to have another crack at?
I really like, even though when you did ask me if I have a favorite killifish I'd like to have and stuff, there is a killifish species called Pyropora. It's a sort of a brilliant blue with sort of various markings depending on the location and stuff. And Ogoense, that's a sort of like a close group. Any species or any localities from that group would be my unicorn fish. As far as I know, they've never been in Australia, even though they are technically on the allowable import list. So that would be my unicorn fish to keep and breed. So they would be amazing. But, like I said before, any killifish and cories that I haven't kept and bred before would be my unicorn fish.
And my last question, which now makes 7, is where can people find you?
So on, like we already touched on it a bit, on YouTube, it's KillieOrCory. On Facebook and Instagram, I'm KillieOrCory or KillieOrCory's Fish Room. So I'm there. I'm sort of happy to answer questions and things and chat to people about fish, because fish keeping and breeding is my, as they say, my jam. I enjoy talking about fish to like-minded people as much as keeping and breeding fish. So that's where people can find me, and anything that I'm doing, in the fish room and breeding, keeping fish. If you can't see a post or a video about it, people can ask me, and I'm happy to do those sort of things as well. So,
cool. Well, thank you very much for your time today. It's been greatly appreciated, and I really do appreciate that after my wee stuff up with the time with daylight savings, you're still very happy to be here at 5 o'clock in the morning. That's pretty massive. So thank you very much for your time. Everyone has appreciated it, and I have definitely had my eyes opened a little bit into the world of killifish. So that's fantastic.
And thank you for the invitation, Cam, and everybody who sort of logged in with your participation, with the questions, and with your presence. Thank you very much. I appreciate you all, and those people who might end up catching this live stream, especially if they're from Australia, because they would have been sleeping. So thank you for tuning in as well. And I would encourage everyone, because Corys are a lot more widely available, if you haven't kept any killifish before, to give them a go. Even if you don't get hooked, they're interesting biology, and the colors, and just the way they are. I'm sure you'll really enjoy the period that you end up having them in your tanks. So, and thanks again for having me, Cam.
No problem.
I appreciate it. I enjoyed myself.
Excellent. Thank you everyone for being with us today. It's been a blast. Have a good one, team. Happy fish keeping. Enjoy your Friday.